Hello, welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today we have someone who is another freedom fighter and liberty warrior, someone who's all about cutting the budget and making sure that government spending is not growing by more than the economy, by really making sure that more money is in your pocket, no matter if that's the state government, the local government, or the federal government, because all of them are spending too much. And it's none other than Dan Mitchell. Dan, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Vance, I'm glad to be with you, but you left out foreign governments. I tell foreign governments not to spend too much as well.
Amen. That's exactly right. You're exactly right. Thank you for the correction. So for the audience, let me go ahead and give you your background, then we'll jump right into our conversation here. We're recording this on March 24th, 2023. And so let me get right into it. Dan Mitchell is president of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, a pro-market public policy organization he founded in 2000. His major research interests include tax reform, international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and other fiscal policy issues. Having also worked at the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute, he has decades of experience authoring papers, writing editorials, working with the public policy community, and presenting the free market viewpoint to newspaper, television, and radio media. Dan has spoken to a wide variety of groups in dozens of cities and more than 50 foreign countries. He also served on the editorial board of the Cayman Financial Review and holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University. So Dan, like I do with every guest who comes on the program, what motivates you to do what you do each and every day?
Well, I have to give the credit to Ronald Reagan because I'm a little bit older than you, and I was around and kicking in high school when Reagan challenged Gerald Ford for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976. And even though my family wasn't political, I guess back then with only 3 TV stations, you had no choice but to watch the news, and whatever Reagan was saying just naturally and instinctively made sense to me. So I thought, oh, okay, I guess means I'll be a political science major in college. Well, it turned out I was really interested in economics, so eventually shifted to that. And I always knew I was drawn to public policy. I always had a very strong philosophical streak, which was that people should have the most freedom possible, and that would be best for society and enable all of us, as your show says, let people prosper.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And Dan, what else brought you to this viewpoint of the more classical liberal perspective? Was there a certain book, I know you mentioned Reagan there, but was there anything else from a more philosophical standpoint, academic standpoint, that brought you to that point?
Ultimately, I wound up doing my PhD at George Mason University, which is sort of the Mecca if you believe in classical liberalism. They have the Austrian school people, the public choice people, all sorts of other economists there. So Reagan got me into it. The whole idea of the battle for freedom and ideas, the classical liberalism, libertarianism, small government conservatism, I don't care what you call it, just are people freer to become more prosperous? Now, obviously, once I got into these ideas, then I started reading more things. But I really do have to say, if it wasn't for Reagan, heck, maybe right now we're running a hardware store in some small town in the country someplace. I have no idea. But yes, it was Reagan. I got into economics, and I've been a policy wonk ever since.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And, we did have some opportunities when I was in D.C., when I was the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump White House. We had some good conversations then, of ways to rein in government spending, which we didn't do a very good job of. There wasn't a good push of doing that. I was able to get in there about a spending, fiscal rule in the last president's budget, but there really wasn't any other push to really get something done there. And so we've had this excessive government spending on for a long time. Reagan talked a good game, but there was still some massive spending by Congress there. Do you ever get, where it's tough to continue on with this messaging of limiting government spending and everything else when you don't see them doing much at the federal level?
I get pessimistic sometimes. I think of myself as being philosophically pessimistic, but operationally optimistic. And when I want to be operationally optimistic, I look at 4 different things. First, we do have a much smaller burden of government spending in the United States than most other developed nations. We're not as good as Switzerland, but we're a lot better than France and Germany and the United Kingdom. Obviously, the Nordic countries have a bigger burden of government spending. So we've done something right. Now, it might not be because of you and me. It might have more to do with our federalist structure. So we should give the founding fathers the credit, not ourselves. But still, we're better off than a lot of other countries in the developed world. But then I also focus on three periods that I think can give us some hope that things can change. First of all, I mentioned I got into public policy because of Reagan. Obviously, Reagan didn't achieve everything he wanted to, but if you look at when he took office and when he left office, the burden of federal government spending fell by about a percentage point of GDP. And even more important, we had a defense buildup necessary to defeat the Soviet Union. So we can understand from a cost benefit perspective why that may have been a good idea. If you look just at domestic spending, the combination of domestic discretionary and entitlements, Reagan reduced that spending by 2.5 percentage points of GDP. So in retrospect, Reagan accomplished a lot more than people give him credit for. But it's not just the Reagan years. Under Bill Clinton, especially after the 1994 election with the Gingrich Revolution, whatever you want to call it, we had a multi-year period of genuine spending restraint. Government only grew, I believe it was 2.9% a year between 1994 and 1998. As a result, deficits turned into surpluses. Why? Because government growing 2.9% a year, nominal GDP and therefore tax revenue growing at twice as fast. So spending restraint really does pay off. And then my third example, and this one will really shock you, but if you think about it, it's not that shocking. During the Obama year, he had a spending blowout when he first got into office. He had his version of a stimulus, which of course was a waste of money, didn't help the economy. That was on top of course, of Bush doing a failed stimulus. But then with the Tea Party taking power, at least in the House of Representatives, in the 2010 election, if you look at the 5-year period between 2009 and 2014, we actually had a nominal spending freeze. And what happened? Because government spending was flat and revenues, even though the economy wasn't going gangbusters back then, it was growing some. So nominal GDP and therefore nominal tax revenues are growing at the same time government is flat. We made tremendous progress, deficit coming down by well more than 50%, the burden of government spending, which I think is more important, falling as a share of GDP. Now, obviously, Obama put the baseline up so high in 2009, it wasn't that difficult to hold it flat for a few years. But during the Tea Party era, Republicans in the House of Representatives and then the Senate after 2014, for a little while, they did a good job. We need the Republican Party and hopefully some Democrats to rediscover the principles of fiscal sanity. I guess we'll see over this next election cycle whether that's possible. But yes, there have been good periods in our lifetimes, Vance, where we actually had multi-year periods of at least semi-fiscal responsibility. The problem is, how can we lock those in and sort of tie the hands of politicians so that they can't go on spending sprees when there's some change in the political environment?
Yeah. No, those are great. A great way to put us back into history and the historical perspective of what's been going on, because you're right. I mean, those were some good spending restraint periods that we need to see again. One of the periods that I also like to look at, which wasn't during our lifetime, was during Calvin Coolidge, actually Harding and then Coolidge. You had a period where there was a cuts in the budget, where they were running massive surpluses and paying down the national debt during that period. So there are ways to do this. To your optimism, which I'm also an optimist. Maybe an optimistic economists don't always go together, but I think we are, at least like you said, operationally to where there are opportunities. And part of that as well, and I've learned a lot from you on this, Dan, with your blog, International Liberty, which I'll make sure to put in the show notes page. You post in there basically every day. I think it is every day, where I'm always getting some good emails and everything else, and following you on Twitter and other places. You talk a lot about not only at the federal level, the international level, as you said earlier, the foreign countries, but also the states. And like you mentioned earlier, our system of federalism is such that we need more happening closer to the people at the state level, and where we have, spending limits, constitutional balanced budget amendments that are happening, in 49 of the 50 states. And so those show us the way of where we need to be headed. But with what the states are doing and what other countries are doing, what do you kind of consider to be the gold standard when it comes to fiscal rules and spending limits and that sort of thing?
There are two gold standards. My international gold standard is Switzerland. They have something called the debt brake. It was imposed by voters in a referendum in 2001, overwhelming landslide, 84.7% of Swiss voters did it. And it's called a debt brake, but it's really a spending cap. And ever since the debt brake or spending cap was enacted, government spending in nominal dollars has grown by an average of only 2.2% a year. So that's really a remarkable track record of success. So while other European countries that surround Switzerland are seeing the burden of government spending grow, they're seeing their debt levels increase. In the case of Italy, I think they're on the verge of a Greek-style fiscal crisis. Switzerland is like an oasis, an island of fiscal sanity, because they have kept government spending under control. They've done a really, really good job. I think that Swiss debt brake / spending cap deserves a lot of the credit. In the United States, I think the gold standard, although maybe it's more of a silver standard because over time, politicians have figured out ways to weaken it. But the TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Colorado, is another spending cap. It's designed a little bit differently, probably actually much more simply. It simply says that revenues can't grow faster than population plus inflation, combined with a balanced budget requirement. That means spending can't grow faster than population plus inflation. Now, the Colorado politicians, they play games with fees and, those aren't really taxes. But nonetheless, TABOR is better than anything else we have in the United States. Because why? It puts the focus where it belongs, on government spending. I mean, I obviously favor, and you obviously favor, balanced budgets and not having big deficits. But it's important to understand that deficits and debt are the symptom. Too much government spending is the underlying disease or problem. And if we took all of our deficit spending that we have, whether in states or at the federal government level, and replaced it with tax finance government spending, would we be any better off? We would have jumped, I don't know, from the frying pan to the fire, from the fire to the frying pan. However you want to use that metaphor, we'd still have a government that's too big, diverting too many resources from the productive sector of the economy. So I want reforms that don't focus on balancing the budget. Heck, 49 out of 50 states have some sort of balanced budget requirement. Does that work to control government spending? No. We need spending caps. TABOR is the best thing we have in the United States, but I'm hoping we're going to see other states adopt things that are even stronger. I know because of some of the good work you did in Texas, they've strengthened their spending cap from, I guess, personal income down to population plus inflation or something like that. And actually, earlier in the show, we were talking about reasons to be optimistic. We've had some great things happening in states the last couple of years. States adopting school choice, states adopting flat taxes, cutting tax rates. I mean, hope is not lost. Still a reason for people like you and me to wake up every day and fight for liberty.
Yeah, amen, amen. I think there is a lot of good stuff going on when you think about the school choice revolution that's happening, which I'm hoping that continues to happen across the nation. I know Florida just passed it. Looks like Georgia hopefully will pass it soon. I'm hoping Texas will this year. It's kind of like Texas should already have it, but they don't have it yet. Hoping that happens. But also with the state flat tax revolution, I mean, just extraordinary what's going on there and how more states are moving in that direction, which means more prosperity, let people prosper, right? And I'm hoping the next one, Dan, is really a responsible state budget revolution, where we can get these sort of fiscal rules like you're talking about here, where you have a spending limit based on population growth plus inflation, to where that also catches on like wildfire across the nation. Because what we don't need to see is kind of the Kansas problem from about a decade ago, where they cut taxes, but then they started running some deficits because of what? Because they spent too much, and then they raised taxes again. And so many people are concerned about that. But I think, you have this, isn't it called the golden rule, Dan?
My golden rule is very simple.
Yes.
The private sector should grow faster than the government. Or you can say it, the government should grow slower than the private sector. Because what is the private sector? The private sector is your tax base. So if your government spending is growing slower than your tax base, you're obviously going to, over time, solve your problems with red ink. But more importantly than that, I want government spending to shrink relative to the size of the productive sector of the economy. That is the key variable. And one of the sort of corollary lessons of this, sort of echoing back to your question, you can't have a good tax system if you have a big government. And actually, this is a great opportunity to say something that I've been trying to repeat to every audience I've spoken to in recent months. If we don't get control of entitlement programs and reform them in the way that the Republicans were trying to do back during the Paul Ryan era and the Tea Party era, if we don't reform those programs, we are going to have giant middle class tax increases, giant tax increases on low-income workers. Why do I say this? Because no country has ever had a European-sized welfare state without taxing the you-know-what out of regular people. Simply stated, there aren't enough rich people to finance big government, either in Europe or here. And so if we let government go out of control, if we don't address the entitlements, it's going to be massive value-added taxes, payroll taxes. I mean, we're going to have taxes, going in one ear, coming out the other. It's going to be very, very bad news for ordinary families across America.
Yeah, it really will be. I mean, and so really what we're talking about with these quote unquote entitlements are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, you could throw that in there as well. But the two big ones are Social Security and Medicare. And it's almost like those are off the table now, even among Republicans. To your point, Paul Ryan did had some good reforms that would have helped with these two programs. Even George W. Bush did, back in the 2000s. But everybody wants to take those off the plate and say, we don't need to touch those. I won't say everybody, but some people are saying we don't need to have those as part of the discussion because it's too politically unpopular. But it seems to me that it's politically unpopular to dramatically raise taxes, right? And destroy the economic prosperity that we have in the economy and everything else. And that's what will ultimately happen. To your point, do you have any sort of key reforms that you would like to see to Social Security and Medicare?
The most important thing to understand about the entitlement problem, it's really the health entitlements that are driving it. Social Security needs to be reformed. We should do what Chile and Australia and Switzerland and Sweden and so many countries around the world have shifted to personal retirement accounts. I'm 100% for that. My dissertation was about Australia's private Social Security system. It's a great system, basically a universal 401k. But in terms of what's driving the long-run growth of government, it's really Medicare and Medicaid, the health entitlements. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. In the early part of last decade, the Ryan budgets, which were passed by the House of Representatives, and Republicans who voted for them were reelected time after time, they were based on block granting Medicaid and shifting Medicare to a premium support system, sort of based on the federal employees' health benefits program, sort of what federal bureaucrats get. Those two reforms, over the long run, by shifting to a more market-oriented, decentralized approach, would have saved trillions of dollars, and that long-run growth of government would have come down a little bit. And so we just simply need to resuscitate that. But you identified the problem. We have politicians like Joe Biden and also Donald Trump who say, no, we can't touch entitlements. That is recklessly irresponsible. Now, I want to correct something I said. If we don't touch the entitlements, it's not necessarily the case that we'll have giant tax increases on lower income and middle class households. We might just print money like Venezuela or Argentina or Zimbabwe, but I don't think it's a good idea. Or maybe we'll just borrow money until we have a Greek-style fiscal crisis. But you know what? I don't think that's a good idea either. So basically, it's reform the entitlement programs with reforms that we already know about, have already been studied. We know they will work. In many ways, they build upon Bill Clinton's welfare reform. We either do that or we have one of three really bad things happen. Out of control inflation because we're financing the budget with the printing press, a Greek-style fiscal crisis because we just let our debt go out of control to the point where investors no longer trust buying bonds from the U.S. government, or we have these giant tax increases on the middle class and lower income households, the value-added tax, the huge social insurance taxes, the massive energy taxes. Just look at what they have in Europe, and you can see how horrible life would be for ordinary families across America if we try to finance big government through taxes. So to me, it's an obvious no-brainer. We have to reform the entitlements, and shame on Biden, shame on Trump for wanting to kick the can down the road, because it'll be that much more difficult to fix the problem once the crisis has started.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, ultimately, like you said earlier, and I echo a lot here on this show, is that the ultimate burden of government is not by how much it taxes, but by how much it spends. And, Milton Friedman always talked about that as well, where, if you're going to spend it, if you're going to inflate it, or if you're going to issue debt, at the end of the day, it's going to be paid for some form of taxes. And so spending is really the major factor here that's influencing the economy. And we've seen this a lot just over the last couple of years, Dan, where we had the shutdowns, which we could talk about pros and cons of that. I think we were both against that, but regardless, we had that was going on. Massive spending bills. And maybe the first round, like the CARES Act, maybe there was some discussion about that was necessary. I don't necessarily think so, but there's probably some good arguments that maybe it was. But then you had multiple spending bills after that, where we've spent, I think the deficit increase over the last 3 years has been about $7 trillion to over $31 trillion in national debt, just a massive increase in just a short period of time that the Federal Reserve, right, to your point that you were just talking about, monetized a large amount of that, where their balance sheet went from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. Now, some of that was mortgage-backed securities and some other assets, but a massive, the majority of that was for Treasury securities. And so you had this massive increase of money that was put into the economy, and then people were somehow thinking that this was going to be transitory inflation. Well, first it was no inflation, then transitory inflation. And at the end of the day, I was like, look, this is going to be persistent inflation. And now people, Dan, are concerned that Silicon Valley Bank collapsed and that you have the Signature Bank collapse and others, globally, there are some other ones that are going out there too, to where when you start raising interest rates, as the Fed has, and started pulling a little bit of money out of the economy, that you're going to have this boom, quote unquote boom, turn into a bust. And we're seeing that now. Is there anything else that you would expand on with what we've seen in the last couple of years?
Two things that I think are worth discussing. First, the Fed, when they engineer an artificial boom, they also at the same time are engineering an inevitable bust. And what we should be angry at the Fed about is not them raising interest rates now. We should be angry at them for massively expanding their balance sheet in 2020 and 2021. Now, I want to be fair. I'm going to bend over backwards here and say, if I'm a Fed governor in March of 2020, with the pandemic starting and everyone thinking, oh my God, the world's coming to an end, maybe tens of millions of people will die, the economy will freeze up, I can understand why they said, okay, we need to just pour credit into the economy so people feel more comfortable. But why were they still doing that in August of 2020? Why were they still doing it in November of 2020 and in February of 2021 and May of 20, all through 2020 and 2021? Yes, there was an initial big spike in the balance sheet, but then it kept growing and growing. And I wish somebody would ask the Fed governors, Chairman Powell, I'd love to have them on the hot seat in front of an intelligent member of Congress, which might be an oxymoron or whatever that term is. But I'd love to have him grilled. Okay, why did you keep expanding the balance sheet once it was obvious the world wasn't coming to an end? Now, by the way, I think they did it not to monetize the debt, because the U.S. can still issue all the debt it wants. And there are plenty of buyers around the world that, because there's so few other good options sometimes for safe assets. I think there are still plenty of buyers for U.S. government debt. I think they engaged in that balance sheet expansion for Keynesian reasons. They just thought this was good to artificially boost the economy. But of course, as you said, sooner or later, the boom is followed by the bust. And I don't know who said it, but there's a famous line that when the Fed steps on the brakes, somebody goes through the windshield. And maybe that's Silicon Valley Bank, maybe it's Signature Bank, maybe it's other businesses in the country who were sort of lured into making bad decisions on the basis of artificially low interest rates. This is the whole sort of Austrian school business cycle theory that I'm sure you're familiar with. But the bottom line is we wouldn't have the trouble today if the Fed hadn't made the mistake in the first place. So again, the two lessons: the Fed shouldn't have made the mistake in the first place. And then the second is, did they do it for fiscal policy reasons, or do they do it for Keynesian, artificially low, goose the economy, artificially low interest rate reasons? I think it's the latter, but there's actually an interesting discussion among policy wonks in DC about why did the Fed do this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And we'll keep learning from it over time. And I think they still have some room to go in raising their interest rate. And really, like you were mentioning earlier, the place that I like to look is their balance sheet. And their balance sheet really hasn't come down much. It peaked in April of 2022 at about $9 trillion. It came down about $600 billion, but just here recently, they've raised it about another $300 billion. So we're only about $300 billion off from that peak of April of 2022. So this really isn't that much quantitative tightening, 3 years after the pandemic started. And so I don't see how we're going to get control of inflation, which right now is running about 6%. when you look at CPI anyway, year over year, but even the core, excluding food and energy, which, I mean, we all buy food and energy stuff, but, that's still running 5.7%, I think is the latest number. So there's a lot of underlying inflation that's going to be in there because the Fed has put so much money into the system. And at the same time right now, where it doesn't look like spending is going to be under control. It looks like we're going to continue to run massive deficits. Even the CBO, Dan, right, which we don't necessarily think that they do a great job in their forecast, okay? But they're showing an average of $2 trillion a year in just deficits over the next decade based on what's happening in the economy, slower growth and everything else, along with just this massive amount of government spending. And by the way, the net interest on the debt is going to be over $1 trillion a year. So that's also crowding out to some extent the budget, which they'll just spend more and inflate some of that away. So, the Fed also has to be cognizant of what's happening in the fiscal space so that it doesn't influence the interest rates that they're trying to target at a lower rate throughout the economy. So it's making it much more difficult for the Fed to be independent if they ever were. And so we've got some major issues as we're moving forward within this sort of system of fiscal policy, monetary policy. What we really need, Dan, and this is kind of what I want to turn to next, is more free market capitalism. Some of the things that I love when you write about this and have your Sunday kind of cartoons is the differences between socialism and capitalism. If you would you mind expanding on some of that and some of your thoughts on the differences?
Well, since I write a column every day, I'm always looking for material. And what I sometimes do is I have sort of an ongoing series: capitalism versus socialism, the case against socialism, the case for capitalism. Or I just wrote a 3-part series about the damage socialism has done to Venezuela. But I sometimes like using cartoons, of course, in addition to charts and graphs, because I think images, for whatever reason, are easier to understand. They resonate. They stick with people longer. Or maybe it's just a case of breaking up the look of something so that it's visually appealing instead of a bunch of words on a page. But the notion is help people understand that the world is a laboratory. In that laboratory, we have some governments that go crazy with socialism and big government and statism and cronyism, because actually there's different types of left-wing economics. You can be a socialist and still believe in I guess you could believe in a competitive price system or something like that. So you can slice it many different ways, but on net, if you're grading overall policy, some places do a very good job: Switzerland, New Zealand, Singapore. Hong Kong used to be way at the top of the list, but now we're much less optimistic about them with China taking over. And there are some countries that routinely do a terrible job. Of course, at the very bottom of every list are Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, places like that. But then there are places in the middle, Greece, Italy. Basically, we're on a path to become Greece and Italy. Is that a good idea? So a lot of what I write in my daily columns, the reason I call my column International Liberty is because I focus a lot on these international comparisons, the lessons we can learn. I even have something called the Anti-Convergence Club, where dozens and dozens of times I've taken two countries that maybe 50 years ago had the same level of per capita GDP, and one country's shot up and the other country has stayed flat. Inevitably, every single time there's a big divergence, in other words, anti-convergence. Inevitably, it's because one country decided to move more towards free markets and limited government, and the other country decided to go with some form of statism, socialism, corporatism, you name it. And actually, one thing that I repeat over and over again is I have what I call the never answered challenge, where I ask my left-wing friends, who I assume every so often read it because they complain to me. I challenge them. Okay, I've shown you dozens of examples of free market-oriented economies outperforming statist-oriented economies. Please show me one example from anywhere in world history of a statist economy outperforming over a period of time a free market-oriented economy. You would think that kind of empirical analysis would be convincing. None of them have ever offered me an example. The best thing they can do is they say, well, Sweden has a big government and they're a rich country. And then I explain to them, well, first of all, they're not nearly as socialist as you think. They just have a big welfare state, but very free market otherwise. But then the most important thing for them to understand is they became rich in Sweden and other Nordic countries back when government was very small. You look from 1870 to 1970, the burden of government in Sweden was smaller than it is in the United States. And it wasn't until the 1900s that some of these countries even got income taxes. It was only with the adoption of value-added taxes in the late 60s, early 70s that the welfare state exploded in size. And that's the Sweden and the Denmark we're looking at now. Now, they're not growing as fast anymore. So the lesson to be learned is they became rich when government was small, and now they're growing slower now that government is big. So why are we're copying the wrong version of Sweden. We don't want to copy Sweden of today. We want to copy the Sweden of 1925 or something like that, just to pick a random year.
Yeah, that's right. And so as we're wrapping up here, Dan, what do you think, what would be kind of your 1 or 2 or 3 items that would best set us up for a path that would let people prosper?
Control spending, limit spending, restrain spending. And I'm not being facetious. I mean, obviously, having a good monetary policy in theory is a completely separate issue. Having a good trade policy is a completely separate issue. But I'm mostly a public finance economist, so I'm pretty biased. And I know 2 things for sure. An ever-growing government is going to make us poorer, regardless of how it's financed. And since I favor things like a flat tax, and getting rid of bad taxes like capital gains taxes and death taxes, if we want to have any semblance of a decent tax system that doesn't penalize people for working, saving, investing, being an entrepreneur, we better control government spending. And by all means, let's focus on especially the long run and the entitlement programs, because we are doomed. We will have a miserable future in terms of fiscal policy if we don't get a hold and control of those programs with the kind of reforms that were being talked about in the early part of last decade. And that's why I get very, very upset with politicians like Biden and Trump, who just think it's okay to kick the can down the road, and they put their own personal political ambitions above the interest of the nation.
Yep. Wise words, Dan. Thank you so much for being a Let People Prosper show. Congrats to your Georgia Bulldogs for the last couple of years. Hopefully that will keep going for you. And I really appreciated and enjoyed our conversation today. For the audience, thank y'all for joining us. Hopefully you'll leave us a 5-star rating. For you, Dan, God bless you and your family. And for the audience, until next time, let people prosper.